The highway doesn't ask questions. It stretches through central Florida like a scar. Flat, indifferent, shimmering in the heat. Truck stops. Rest areas. Pine trees bleeding into gray sky. A woman with her thumb out. A man who slows down. In 1989, something began along these roads. Something that would eventually reach every television in America, every newspaper stand, every courtroom conversation about violence, justice, and the women's society forgets. The story would be twisted into tabloid headlines. It would be turned into a film that won an Academy Award. It would be reduced to a caricature. The monster in the mugshot, the wild eyes, the shaking fists. But before the cameras arrived, before the legal system closed around her like a fist, before the execution chamber in Stark, Florida, on a quiet October morning in 2002, there was just a woman, damaged, desperate, dangerous, and a stretch of interstate that would not let her disappear. Her name was Aileen Wuornos, and the question that haunts this case, the question that no verdict, no confession, no psychological report has ever fully answered, is this: where exactly does victimhood end, and where does something else begin? She was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan. A leap year baby, an unwanted one. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was not present at the birth. He was in prison, convicted of kidnapping and child molestation. He would later be committed to a psychiatric institution and die by suicide in 1969, never having met his daughter. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, was 15 years old when Aileen was born. She would abandon the family when Aileen was 4, leaving her and her older brother Keith with their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, in the small town of Troy, Michigan. Aileen and Keith were never legally adopted. They were told, for years, that Lori and Britta were their biological parents. They were not told the truth until much later. What happened inside that house in Troy is filtered through Aileen's own accounts that were sometimes contradictory, sometimes impossible to independently verify, always charged with the emotional voltage of a person who carried her childhood like an open wound. What is documented is this: Aileen described a household characterized by emotional coldness and, she claimed, physical abuse. Lori Wuornos was, by most accounts, a heavy drinker. The home was not a stable one. By the age of 11, Aileen had begun exchanging sexual acts with older boys and men in exchange for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money. She was not doing this out of precocity or rebellion. She was doing it because she had learned, early and irreversibly, that her body was the most reliable currency she possessed. At 13, she was pregnant. The circumstances of that pregnancy, whether by assault or coercion or something more complicated, were never clearly established. She gave the child up for adoption in January 1971. Shortly after that, her grandmother Britta died. Her grandfather Lori told Aileen and Keith to leave. She was 15 years old. She was on her own. What followed was decades of survival on the margins. She hitchhiked. She drifted south, eventually settling into a transient existence across Florida. She was arrested multiple times for disorderly conduct, assault, passing forged checks, armed robbery. She married, briefly, a man named Lewis Fell in 1976, who was 69 years old to her 20. He filed for annulment within weeks, citing Aileen's violent behavior. She worked as a prostitute for most of her adult life. It was not a choice constructed from options. It was what was available. She was not unknown to law enforcement by the time the first body turned up. She was, by then, simply one of the invisible people, the ones who cycle through county jails and rest-stop bathrooms and cheap motel rooms without anyone writing anything down that matters. In late 1986, she met Tyria Moore at a Daytona Beach gay bar. Moore was 24. Wuornos was 30. By most accounts, something real happened between them. Something that functioned, for Aileen Wuornos, as the closest thing to genuine human attachment she had experienced in her adult life. They moved in together, in a series of shared motel rooms and rented spaces, supported almost entirely by Wuornos' continued work as a roadside prostitute. Their relationship would persist for nearly 4 years. It would also place Moore at the center of a criminal investigation that neither of them could have anticipated. The first known victim was Richard Mallory. He was 51 years old, the owner of an electronics repair shop in Clearwater, Florida. His body was found on December 13, 1989, wrapped in a piece of carpet in a wooded area off Interstate 95 in Volusia County. He had been shot multiple times with a .22 caliber firearm. He had been dead for approximately 3 weeks before he was found. What investigators would eventually discover, and what would not become a focal point of Aileen's trial, a fact that has troubled legal observers for years, is that Richard Mallory had, in 1957, been convicted of violent sexual assault in Maryland and served nearly a decade in prison. This was not known, or not surfaced, during his portrayal in early media coverage as simply a businessman who had disappeared. The second victim was David Spears, found May 31, 1990, 43 years old, shot 6 times with a .22. His truck was found separately. The third was Charles Carskadden, found June 6, 1990, 40 years old, 9 gunshot wounds, a part-time rodeo worker. The fourth was Peter Seams. He disappeared in June 1990, and his body was never found. Only his car, a 1988 Pontiac Sunbird, would be recovered, crashed on a dirt road in Marion County. 2 women were seen fleeing the scene. Witnesses gave descriptions. A composite sketch was released. The fifth was Troy Burress, found August 4, 1990, 50 years old, a sausage delivery driver, shot twice. The sixth was Dick Humphreys, found September 12, 1990, 56 years old, a retired Alabama chief of police who had recently moved to Florida to work as a state child abuse investigator. 7 bullet wounds. The seventh was Walter Gino Antonio, found November 19, 1990, a reserve police officer, shot 4 times. He was found nearly naked in a remote area. His badge, his police equipment, and his car were recovered separately. 7 men, 7 deaths, all along the highways of central Florida, all killed with the same caliber weapon, all in the same general region. The investigators who were beginning to connect these cases by late 1990 knew they were looking for something they had not encountered before in American criminal history, if the suspect was who the evidence was beginning to suggest. The composite sketches, the abandoned cars, the pawned property. Items belonging to several of the victims had been pawned in Daytona Beach. Florida law requires pawnbrokers to take thumbprints. Those thumbprints came back to a name, Cammie Green, an alias. But when investigators ran the prints through the database, a real identity emerged: Aileen Wuornos. Law enforcement had been building a case for months before she was arrested. They had her name. They had physical evidence. What they needed, what they pursued with methods that would later generate significant controversy, was a confession. To obtain it, they enlisted Tyria Moore. Moore had already been identified by investigators as a likely associate. She was located in Pennsylvania, where she had returned to live with her family. Investigators made clear to her the legal jeopardy she faced. They also offered her something: immunity from prosecution in exchange for cooperation. What followed between January 9th and January 14th, 1991, was a series of recorded phone calls. Moore called Wuornos from investigators' premises under their direction. She told Aileen she was afraid. She told her she needed her to talk to police. She told her, in one emotionally charged exchange, that she worried she might be implicated in things she hadn't done. Aileen Wuornos, for her part, told Moore not to worry. She told her she would take the fall. That Moore had nothing to do with any of it. The investigators were listening to every word. Wuornos was arrested on January 9th, 1991, at the Last Resort biker bar in Port Orange. She was drunk. She was loud. She didn't initially know they knew. She confessed on January 16th. In that confession, she stated that she had killed all 7 men in self-defense, that each of them had either raped her or attempted to rape her during a commercial encounter, and that she had acted to protect her own life. She was, she insisted, not a predator. She was a survivor. The prosecution's response to this claim was systematic and devastating. They argued that the self-defense narrative was implausible across 7 separate incidents with 7 separate men, all killed by the same method, all robbed of their belongings afterward. They argued that the robberies indicated a financial motive. They argued that the evidence, specifically the location of the victim's wounds and the evidence from the crime scenes, was inconsistent with the kind of close-quarters struggle she described. They had forensic evidence. They had physical evidence. They had the pawned property. They had, critically, her own confession. Her trial for the murder of Richard Mallory began in January 1992. She was represented by public defenders. The trial lasted less than 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 91 minutes. They found her guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to death. What was not presented to that jury, and what would only surface later through investigative journalism, was the full extent of Richard Mallory's criminal history. His 1957 conviction for violent sexual assault, the nature of that crime, the decade he had served. Florida law at the time would theoretically have allowed this evidence to be introduced to support the self-defense claim, but it was not introduced. Her attorneys did not discover it in time, or did not successfully introduce it. The question of what a jury might have concluded if they had known who Richard Mallory was remains permanently open. It doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't exonerate her for the other 6 deaths. But it sits in the record of this case like a splinter that was never fully removed. She entered pleas in 5 of the remaining cases, receiving additional death sentences. The Seams case, whose body was never found, was never prosecuted. The media arrived in force. By the time of her trial, Aileen Wuornos had already been labeled by major outlets as America's first female serial killer, a designation that is historically inaccurate, as criminologists and historians have documented numerous female serial killers in American history, but which served the media's narrative perfectly. She was a new kind of monster. She was a headline. She was a cultural event. The cameras found her easily. She was physically striking, even in the worst photographs. She had the kind of face that communicates damage in a way that is both unsettling and magnetic. She was volatile in court. She shouted. She accused. She made it very easy to frame her as unhinged. Documentary filmmakers came to interview her on death row. She gave interviews that were alarming, that were sometimes paranoid, that shifted between apparent lucidity and what many observers described as a deteriorating mental state. At various points, she claimed that prison guards were contaminating her food, that a conspiracy was operating against her, that her appeals were being deliberately sabotaged. She also, at various points, recanted her self-defense claims entirely. saying in some interviews that she had killed out of hatred and for robbery, not in self-defense. Then she contradicted those recantations. Then she asserted them again. The shifting accounts did enormous damage to any consistent narrative of her mental state or her motivations. They also made it extremely difficult, perhaps impossible, to know what was true. A film was made about her. Charlize Theron won the Academy Award for Best Actress for playing her. The film was called Monster. It arrived in 2003, the year after her execution. The timing gave it a particular quality, hagiographic in some ways, horrifying in others, caught between wanting to humanize her and being unable to fully escape the gravity of what she had done. Her relationship with Tyria Moore ended, functionally, with Moore's testimony against her. Whether Moore's participation was coerced by investigators or given willingly, the result was the same. The person Wuornos had tried hardest to protect was the person who helped seal her fate. This is one of the most emotionally devastating elements of the case, not because it makes Wuornos a simple victim of betrayal, but because it reveals the particular cruelty of her situation. The one relationship she had built that felt like love was, in the end, a mechanism of her prosecution. The victims' families do not appear in many of the documentary accounts. They are present in court records, in victim impact statements, in photographs. They are the part of this story that gets swallowed by the spectacle of Wuornos herself. 7 men had families. They had children, some of them. They had people who waited for them to come home, and then spent years afterward trying to understand something that doesn't become easier to understand with time. Their names deserve to be said clearly, without theater. Richard Mallory, David Spears, Charles Carskadden, Peter Seams, Troy Burress, Dick Humphreys, Walter Gino Antonio. Whatever the circumstances of each individual death, whatever the truth of each specific encounter, they are gone. Their families carry that permanence. She spent over a decade on Florida's death row. Her mental state, as documented by observers and legal representatives over those years, deteriorated noticeably. She dismissed her appeals. In 2001, she requested that her execution be carried out and that her remaining appeals be halted. She stated publicly that she was ready to die. She stated that she had made peace with God. In her final interview, conducted shortly before her execution, she stated something that has stayed in the record of the case as one of its most unsettling fragments. She said that she would be back, that the government had targeted her, that forces beyond those in the room were responsible for what had happened to her. She was calm when she said it. She was coherent. She was also, by almost every clinical assessment available, deeply mentally ill. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Carol Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Stark. She was 46 years old. Her last meal was a cup of coffee. Her last recorded words, before the injection was administered, expressed a simple wish to reach heaven. What do you do with a story like this? The simple version is easy to tell. Woman with a violent past begins killing men on Florida highways. She is caught. She is convicted. She is executed. Justice is served. But the simple version requires ignoring too many things. It requires ignoring what happened to her as a child, and what those things do to a human being over decades. It requires ignoring the documented history of Richard Mallory. It requires ignoring the methods used to obtain her confession. It requires ignoring the clinical assessments of her mental health and what they say about whether the woman who entered those pleas was fully competent to do so. It requires ignoring the question of whether a woman surviving through prostitution on rural Florida highways in the late 1980s had any realistic avenue for legal recourse if something violent happened to her. None of that makes her innocent. The evidence of what she did is extensive and documented. 7 people are dead. That is real, and it is permanent. But the more honest version of this story is harder. It asks you to hold 2 things at once: the reality of her crimes and the reality of what made her. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of a society that failed a child catastrophically, that left a damaged adult with no resources, no safety net, and no options, and then expressed shock when the damage metastasized into something lethal. She was not a monster who emerged from nowhere. She was the end product of years of neglect, abuse, abandonment, and a survival strategy that the world had handed her before she was old enough to choose otherwise. That does not excuse 7 deaths, but it also does not disappear. The highway is still there. The pine trees. The rest stops. The miles of flat Florida interstate that watched all of it happen and kept no record, held no memory, and offered no answer. Somewhere in the archive there is a photograph of Aileen Wuornos taken before any of it began. A young woman with light eyes, looking directly at the camera, looking like someone whose story has not yet been written, looking like someone who might have been anything. The tragedy of Aileen Wuornos is not that she was a monster. Monsters are simpler. They do not ask anything of us. The tragedy is that she was a person, and we already know how that ends. Script based exclusively on documented historical records, court proceedings, verified journalistic investigations, and publicly available primary sources related to the Aileen Wuornos case.